Okay, and so I'm going to be talking about container tips and tricks. Like I said, I'm with the University of California, Davis, Risk and Safety Solutions Department, but I'm actually not representing UC Davis tonight. I'm on my own, but be happy to talk to you about, what we do if you'd like afterwards. Okay, so basically this is going to be a basic overview of some tips and tricks that might help you with containers like Docker and Kubernetes. I'm going to go over some simple things like nicer output, using something like Docker PS, pipe it to less with the -s, or Kubernetes with the -o wide. That will give you some nicer output. Something like that, where you can see it better. I think it's a little bit off on the screen here. I apologize for that. I didn't anticipate the screen size. And the equivalent with Kubernetes wide will give you a little bit of a nicer output when you're looking at things. Okay, so building images. I don't know how many of you have worked with Docker or Kubernetes. A few of you, or a lot of you? Great. Okay, so it seems like a lot of people in my department didn't really know what the difference between add and copy was. And so add is better for when you just want to add a file to a location. Copy is better when you have a tar file that you want to extract, or using a URL to do that. Okay, some best practices. I apologize, I didn't bring my glasses, so I'm going to look up here. I put some links. I gave Frank the copy of the slides, and I'll make it available on the meetup page or something to get you guys a copy of the slides so you can look at them later as well. Some links to best practices. One thing you want to do is keep your image sizes as small as possible. So do things like bundle all your commands together on one line if you can. Use as few lines as possible. Use a program called Docker Squash. It's a third-party product. One of the Docker developers wrote. And then I have a link for an example that Jason does, and then also a link to 5 ways that you can slim your Docker containers down. This is really important for when you're trying to deploy a copy of your container, because the larger the size of your image, the longer time it's going to take to download and transfer over the network. I know a lot of the network latency is not a big deal these days, but still, if you're running hundreds or thousands of copies of something, well, actually in that case it's not going to matter, because it's going to share the memory and network space. But when you're pulling things down, or if it's calling a suite of applications, then it can take a while to download and deploy your application. Okay, another good practice is to use multi-stage builds. How many of you are using multi-stage builds? A few of you? Okay. So this is a really good way to take all your tools and everything that you want to use, like in your DevOps environment, and build your application, and then you throw that into another space, and then you can build your image just from your application code instead of bundling all those tools with it. So that's good for many things like security and not having these tools available on your image. Another thing is to name your build stages. As you're building a Docker container, you'll notice that it'll give you a little step each time it builds a layer. It'll give you a code basically for that image. And at each of those stages, that code can be useful, because if your build fails, you can go back to the last successful build. You can do a Docker exec, jump into your container, and then run the command that failed and see what the output is, or test it manually that way if you need to. And then the link also will go over some more details that I have up here about multi-stage build and how to name your build stages. Okay, and here's a link. I am not an expert with PowerPoint. I'm a Linux guy. I pretty much stay my whole day in the command line. But this is a link to a best, or not a best practice, but an effective image creation. It's done by Abby Fuller, and she presented at DockerCon and I think some of the KubeCons. She's an excellent speaker. The video is about 43 minutes long, but I highly recommend it. It's a really good way to go over your images, and she provides a lot of useful information there. Okay, labels are your friend. I have some examples here of labeling your Docker container, labeling your, use a label with your node, your kube containers. If it's all right with all of you, I'll just do the command line stuff after, so that I can just kind of go through the slides, since that way I'm not jumping around on the slides and back and forth to the command line. Docker inspect, it's another useful way to get information from your containers. You can do a Docker inspect on the container name, on your network, on your storage, and it gives a full detail of what you're using, like your storage engine, your file systems, things like that. Kubernetes has the kubectl describe option, so you can use describe to get similar information from Kubernetes. Okay, and open and test a port. I kind of have this little liner that I came up with for testing ports. So a lot of times our developers will give me a whole bunch of ports to open up on the load balancer for applications. And they'll request them all at once for our dev environment, our stage environment, our production environment. And until we have the application running, you can't tell if the load balancer rules or the rewrites that you wrote are working properly. So I use this little one-liner to fire up a Docker container running BusyBox and Netcat, and just basically a little one-liner that says your service is working. So you can go to the web browser, test the port out, see that it's working. Okay, Docker as root user. Hopefully everybody here knows it's a big no-no if you can help it, right? So those of you that are security minded, don't use it. Don't use root user if you can in your containers. Run it as an unprivileged user. But there are some times that you might need to use a root user. So an example I had is, I've got one diehard developer that insists on using Mercurial, and Jenkins doesn't come with Mercurial out of the box. And the plugins, in the Docker container, it doesn't add Mercurial for you. So Jenkins, they did a great image. It runs on Jetty, but it runs as the Jenkins user. So I had to go in, do a Docker exec, use the -0 or -root, and the name of the container and the shell that you want to use. So sh or shell, bourne shell or bash, and then you can install the application. So in my case, install Mercurial for that. Okay, iteration. So just a simple way to go through and, let's say you needed to find out what versions of Tomcat you're running. So you could run this script and it'll show you all the versions of Tomcat that are running. It's basically taking the output of a Docker PS command, giving you the first column, feeding it to the version command. So this is kind of just like a little hack. If you're running other containers as well, it's going to error out on those containers, but the ones that are running Tomcat, it will give you the version for those containers. Okay, so Docker export is a nice little command that will take any one of your running containers and export it to a tar file for you. And I found this really useful in troubleshooting one of our Tomcat images. We had an application, the developer wrote it, we put it into, we converted it to Docker, and we couldn't get it to work. Everything we tried, it wasn't working. So, trying to troubleshoot it, we're like, okay, how can we test this? Is it, the application code? Is it the Java version? Is it Tomcat itself? So what we did is we took the running container, exported the container, and then you can take the container, you then untar it over your root file system on a bare metal system, and then it'll give you the same directory structure that's running in the container. Then keep in mind you'll have to add things back in, like your environment variables if you pass those to the application, and you might have to set things like your Java path or something like that if you're using Tomcat. Okay, Kubernetes. Are many of you using Kubernetes? Any Minikube users? Okay, so Minikube is a great little tool or resource for being able to set up a cluster on your local laptop or your local desktop machine. You can then run commands on the cluster and test things out locally. Now, if you're on a Mac and using the latest Edge version of Docker for the Mac, you can enable Kubernetes support for that. And that makes it really handy, so then you don't have to even install Minikube. Okay, this is just a slide that has some links to code shell completion, so that you can easily expand the commands on the command line for both Docker and Kubernetes, and also Docker Compose if you use that. And then just another page that I had a bunch of references that I like to use that I had for my developers to help them start out. Kubernetes cheat sheet, kubectl for Docker users, that kind of helps you, okay, I was using Docker or Docker Compose, what are some of the equivalent ways to run the Kubernetes commands. Also, Kubernetes best practices, and then finally Compose with a K. It's a nice little tool where you can take your Docker Compose files and convert those to a YAML file that you can use with the Compose command for Kubernetes and then run things in Kubernetes. So save you a little trouble in the transition. Okay. And then my last slide is basically about community. I'm really big on community. I want to thank Outlier for inviting me here. Upgrade for hosting this. I'd like to say get involved, speak. It's a great way to learn the subject matter yourself, to kind of integrate your learning and really enforce what you know about things. Okay, so that was the last slide there. Is there anything that you guys have questions on? And then I can maybe just focus on those.
Do you use a service mesh?
Do I use a service mesh? Currently we're not. We're mostly a Docker and Docker Compose shop right now. We're looking at moving to Kubernetes. Some things that we do use Docker Swarm on, but not really a mesh. It's mostly right now we're using the load balancer and then like multiple copies of containers. In some cases we are using Swarm, but it's mostly for the operations side of things.
So if you have an application, do you have Nginx also inside the same container or separate?
We started off using both the application and Nginx as one. Then we've split it off, so we have like an Nginx client running Nginx, and then we have a server side for the backend side of it. So we have a little bit of both.
Is it one-to-one or one Nginx from the container?
Most cases it's one-to-one. There are some cases where it's a few Nginx containers for one or two of the applications. It's kind of hard for me to answer that because we have essentially one main web page that is a universal entry point for our application. So it appears to our users and customers as one application, but there's roughly 30 or 40 backend applications that are run for our different, that make up the suite of applications. And then there's a bunch of microservices that make up some of the applications. And so some of them are running Nginx, some of them are running their own web server, some of them are running Tomcat, some are running Node.js, some are running Angular. I was trying to think, the mean stack, yeah. So some of them are running Angular on the application itself. Yeah. Any other questions? Or? Okay. I actually, let's see, we'll start here. Oh, that's it. Okay, yeah. Okay, so I have, that's like your service is working. That's the one-line script I did. I tried to run all these in advance so I'd have them available. So I know we only had 20 minutes to talk. Just go through my history here. Okay. Whoops, wrong one. Okay, so in this example, I'm going to put in port 8090. And then it errors out on this because I wrote this on a Linux machine and then I forgot that Mac doesn't support hostname-i. So some of these things you might have to adjust to the platform that you're running on. And basically that's the output that you're going to get. And you can change the wording to your liking. You can actually feed it an HTML file if you want as well. I'm just going to go back to the slide here for okay, there's an example of using the labels. And if I do, I actually name my Tomcat instances Tom Kitty. So you'll see that I have two of them running, Tomcat 8 and a Tomcat 9 image. And then that's the two images that are running there. All right, thank you.